ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
India's Narendra Modi told anyone who'd listen he'd win the election in a landslide. Well, it was a shock, but he didn't. He's held on to power, but his party has lost its power in the parliament. Today, my colleague Avani Dias discusses the result, how Prime Minister Modi has worked to cement his power, and her own ordeal of being hounded and harassed because of her reporting on the ground there. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Avani, it's always really hard to fathom when India goes to the polls because it's such a huge nation and there are so many voters that logistically it's just next level, it's incredible.
It really is. I mean, when you think about even just the electoral stuff, it's 15 million people who are actually making this happen, and that is about the amount of Australians who are allowed to vote. I mean, it really is mind-boggling to think about. And India has this amazing electric voting system. So they take these huge machines all across the country, and they're really proud about the fact that they get a voting booth to every individual Indian, and there are nearly 1 billion Indians who are registered to vote and able to cast a vote. And they go across the Himalayas, they go through glaciers, jungles. They even go to this random guy in the middle of a forest in Gujarat to make sure that he gets a voting booth to actually be able to cast that ballot. So the sheer size of the democratic election is pretty cool to see.
Yeah, talk about democracy at work.
Totally.
There was something like 640 million votes at this ballot. And my gosh, it's always colourful. I mean, it's great, I can imagine, to actually be there and see that unfold.
People do call it this festival of democracy. There are people dancing in the streets at these enormous rallies, and I've been to so many Narendra Modi rallies, and when he comes out, the kind of reception he gets, it really does feel like you're at this crazy concert, and, it's really unlike anything else, that kind of excitement that his fans feel for him.
24 का ये चुनाव मजबूत भारत बनाने के लिए है.
All right, well, look, before we look at the actual election result and what's happened, I just want to talk first with you about Narendra Modi as a leader. For a long time, he was really, really popular, like approval rating up at 80%, unheard of.
Yeah, one of the most popular leaders in the world for a period of time. When Narendra Modi was vying to become the Prime Minister, what really resonated with voters in India was he said, I'm against this corruption, I'm against this elitist politics, I'm your ordinary man, I'm just like you, I had a really humble upbringing, I'm a normal person. And that really resonated with voters and really gave him that popularity for a really long time.
Well, he received a rock star welcome when he came to Sydney a year ago. Of course, Anthony Albanese even called him the boss.
I said to my friend, the Prime Minister, before, the last time I saw someone on the stage here was Bruce Springsteen, and he didn't get the welcome that Prime Minister Modi has got. Prime Minister Modi is the boss.
Namaste, Australia.
A lot of people came out to see him here in Australia. So as you mentioned, he first came to power in 2014 with the party known, of course, as BJP. So what sort of India did he want to create, and has he created? What have we seen under his leadership?
Yeah, so Narendra Modi, he really wanted to create this India which was an economic driver, which was empowering for normal Indians. He wanted it to be recognised as a global superpower, like countries like the US and China, and he's definitely succeeded on that. But he was also really controversially saw India's foundations of this secular country as something different. You know, Narendra Modi has these fascinating roots. He actually joined a group called the RSS, which is this far-right Hindu nationalist organisation that believes secular India should be a Hindu First Nation. And it's worth noting, Sam, that there are hundreds of millions of people who are Muslims, Sikhs, Christians. They're huge populations of people following these other religions in India, but Hinduism is the majority religion. And Narendra Modi was saying, as Hindus, we've been neglected. We have seen our religion being paved away by these other religions taking over. And that really resonated with the Hindu majority. And that was the kind of nation that he started building. So when he came to power a decade ago, we saw this series of policies which tried to make India this Hindu First Nation.
So there was a sort of a strident form of Hindu nationalism that he wanted to bring in, and an uptick in Muslim persecution. But not only that, there was a real slide, wasn't there, in democratic principles.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? We talk about how huge this vote is, how amazing this democratic exercise has been in the last few weeks in terms of this election. But then some of those democratic pillars, things like the courts and how they functioned, the freedom of the press, which is such an important pillar of democracy, people's ability to talk publicly and openly, critics were saying those were being threatened. We saw things when I was the correspondent in Delhi in Parliament where certain opposition MPs were getting kicked out of Parliament by Modi when they were saying things that he didn't like, and people thought, how are we even functioning when this Parliament isn't operating properly? So on one hand, people loved Modi for these economic ideals and for giving them this strength and this identity about India. But on the other hand, they were saying, look what's happening to democracy and the foundations of this country.
Yeah, an erosion in civil liberties. And you actually experienced that as a reporter, didn't you, really? Just tell me about that, because they didn't really like your reporting.
It was a really unsettling experience. Modi's supporters online really started coming for me. There was this sheer huge number of trolls and doxing, and they sort of would threaten you that way. But things really escalated this year when I did a story for the ABC's Foreign Correspondent program about Sikh separatism and accusations that India had assassinated a foreign dissident in Canada.
We're taking you to the heartland of this movement considered so dangerous by the Indian government. It's now at the centre of an international murder conspiracy.
And that's when the Indian government really started coming down on me. We were followed by intelligence, we were questioned, we were stopped from filming in certain places. When that story came out, it was the Indian government blocked it on social media and on YouTube. It was deemed a national security threat. And then later that week in March, I got a call saying my visa would not be renewed because my reporting crossed a line and that I'd breached rules because of that. And so it was a real shock to the system, because this was, we knew that there could be threats to our reporting and a clampdown, but I never thought that my visa wouldn't get renewed.
So press freedom is really under threat under Narendra Modi. And just to clarify, the government did actually give you a visa when you were all packed up and you were ready to leave, and it just came way too late. And also, of course, the government was making it really difficult for you to report there. So, Avani, let's look now at this shock, I think, election result in a sense, because his party, the BJP, it had promised this landslide victory. It was part of its campaigning, really, and they were really confident that was going to happen.
Yeah, Narendra Modi was out there saying, look, we're going to get 400 seats. That would be a historic landslide victory. He was out there saying that all the time. He was so confident. The polls were showing he would get those numbers. And it's been fascinating to watch the last 24 hours. I have a bit of FOMO that I'm not there on the ground able to cover it, because it is such an interesting result to see. You know, he's barely making a majority, and he's going to have to work with these smaller coalition parties parties to actually form a government. And I think that's a defeat for Narendra Modi. He may have won the election on paper and in terms of numbers, but Narendra Modi is the type of leader that is used to, as we just discussed, having this outright majority, having huge power, huge popularity, and therefore able to kind of do whatever he wants. And he's had that free reign for a decade. And now we are going to see a Narendra Modi, which is going to have to work with other parties to try and figure out how to make government and actually pass policy.
Yeah, right. Not something I think that he will enjoy that much, Avani. So this result is partly because opposition parties concerned about the country's democracy had actually joined forces. Just explain that. Well, like, what happened that this landslide just didn't occur anymore?
India has dozens and dozens of parties within parliament because it is just so huge. And they all disagree. They think differently about how they should rule India. They think differently about how they believe the country should come together. But more than 24 of them united in their hatred for Narendra Modi. They said, we can't let this go on in the future. But then what we saw in the last few months was infighting. We saw difficulties about who would be the face of the opposition, who would actually control the most seats. There were all these logistical dramas coming out, which actually kind of dented their campaigning over the last few months. But then what we've obviously seen is this resonating of their message, right? People all over the country actually thinking, yeah, we do agree in some ways. And so it is interesting that their message has resonated. And I think in the next 5 years, if they can come together, they're going to be a real threat for Modi and his party.
Yeah, okay, because he's got another 5 years in power now. What's he actually had to say, Narendra Modi, about this result? I'm guessing he's put a sugar coating on it.
Yes, he has come out and really celebrated this win.
Today's victory is the victory of the world's largest democracy. In our third term, this country will see a new chapter of big decisions. This is Modi's guarantee.
But I'm sure that behind the scenes, he's at home thinking, this isn't what we thought, this isn't what we wanted.
So how is he actually going to react to this result? Will he go further in trying to strengthen his power, his stronghold, and chip away further at democratic principles? Can he do that?
That is such an interesting question, Sam, and I've been thinking about it as well, because in the last 6 weeks, it's this monster voting campaign period, right? It goes for so long. I think we saw a bit of desperation from Narendra Modi. We saw him talking out against minorities in a way that we haven't really before. He was saying things deemed hate speech against Muslims. And I think that was a sign of his desperation. He knew he wasn't as popular, and we've seen that in the vote result now. And so what some analysts say is the next 5 years, he could harden his stance. We could see him deepening that kind of rhetoric against minorities and that those threats to democratic institutions. At the same time, though, will he be able to do it and pass legislation when he needs to get some of these smaller parties on side who don't necessarily agree with that religious divisiveness that he's now known for?
It'll be interesting to watch it unfold. So, Avani, what about our relationship with India, Australia's relationship? What does it all mean for that?
Oh, you mentioned Albanese calling him the boss a while ago, which I think maybe is haunting him a little bit now. You know, it was such a rock star welcome for Narendra Modi. We saw India-Australia relations on steroids in the time that I was the correspondent. They met so many times. Albanese came to India a lot. It meant we were really busy on the ground, but it also meant that the India-Australia relationship just kept growing and growing economically. But now I think behind the scenes, even though Australia hasn't publicly condemned any of these criticisms of Narendra Modi, I do know that behind the scenes, Australia is considering it. We've seen some glimmers of Penny Wong saying that they are concerned about these threats to democracy. And so I wonder if the Australian government will try to be a bit more forceful about that now that Modi is in a bit more of a precarious position. He doesn't have that outright power that he once did.
All right. Well, I'm sorry you missed reporting on the election, but thank you for your reporting, Avani.
Thanks so much.
Avani Dias is the ABC's former South Asia correspondent and host of Looking for Modi, podcast which you can find on the ABC Listen app. This episode was produced by Bridget Fitzgerald and Jess O'Callaghan. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.